Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give it a few more minutes and we'll let people sign in, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. For everyone logging on, we're going to wait a few more moments, maybe a minute or two, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Give everyone the opportunity to log in. All right, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending the virtual public workshop for the Charlotte Enhancement Project's Environmental Assessment. My name is Sarah Potter, and I am the project manager for Landerman Brown, the consultant who's preparing the EA for the City of Charlotte. Also with me is Jack Christine, the COO of Charlotte, and he will be available after the presentation to assist with answering questions. The draft EA document was published on April 16th and is now available on our project website. Comments on the draft EA will be accepted through June 1st of this year, and information on where to submit the comments is provided at the end of this presentation. This presentation today and the presentation tomorrow are exactly the same. No new information will be presented in either meeting. Some background and meeting logistics. So this, the City of Charlotte is hosting this virtual public workshop, and it's just to summarize what the findings were in the draft EA. It's going to start, as I mentioned, with the presentation and then followed by the Q&A session with myself and Jack. Attendees' audio and webcams they're disabled. So in order to submit questions, if you take your cursor there and hover it over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You can go ahead and press that and enter your questions throughout the presentation. I do ask, if you have a specific question about a certain slide, if you would put the slide number so that we could reference it. If there are media inquiries, if there are any media folks on this presentation, we ask that you please email media@cltairport.com for all inquiries you might have. I also want to mention that comments and questions submitted during this presentation are not included in the official record of comments. So we highly encourage everyone to submit your comments and your questions via either through the public hearing that follows this presentation, or through the email address, or via the U.S. Postal Service. And then at the end, we'll summarize all the questions that we received in the final EA and prepare responses to them. And lastly, I want everyone to know that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on our project website. All right, so getting into the actual presentation, it's going to start with reviewing the roles. in preparing the EA. We're going to then talk about the EA process, review the purpose and need and alternatives, and then we'll present the potential environmental impacts and end with the Q&A and discuss how to submit a written comment. So the FAA is the lead federal agency and is ultimately responsible for compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and is also responsible for the scope and content of the EA. And at the end of the process, they are the ones who actually will issue a decision on the project and implementation of the project. The City of Charlotte is the airport sponsor, and they are responsible for preparing the EA in accordance with NEPA and all other regulations. And then the city also leads all public outreach for the EA. They also direct the work of the consultant, which is Landerman Brown, who I work for, and we are preparing the EA. And we then also direct the work of the sub-consultants that are assisting us on the EA preparation. All right, so the purpose of an EA is to analyze and document potential environmental effects from a proposed project, or what we call the proposed action, and any alternatives. And then you're supposed to develop mitigation measures that would mitigate any of the impacts that you could have from the project. So this slide shows the actual EA process, which started with the conversion from the EIS that was going on prior to the EA, and then it leads into the confirmation of the purpose and need, development of the alternatives, describing the affected environment, and leading into the environmental impacts for each alternative. As I mentioned, the draft EA was published on April 16th, and we're now in the public review and comment period, which is 45 days long. Today and tomorrow, we're holding these virtual workshops and hearings, which will give you the opportunity, the hearing gives you the opportunity to for the public to submit oral comments on the draft EA document. Following the 45-day comment period, all of the comments will be summarized and included in the final EA document, and then the FAA will ultimately issue their federal decision. So moving on to the purpose and need, there are two needs that the airport is addressing with the project. The first need is insufficient gate capacity and ramp congestion. A gating analysis was completed on the FAA approved forecast, and the results you'll see on the screen are in the table. A total of 140 gates would be needed in 2028, and 150 are needed in 2033. If no additional gates are constructed in the future, aircraft would continue to hold on the airfield after landing to wait for an open gate. Having aircraft hold on the airfield results in increased congestion on the pavement surrounding the terminal. Excessive wait times during these peak arrival periods will affect all of the airline's schedule integrity, which ultimately means that you could miss your connection. Complicating the gate shortage is also the ramp movement area, which is the pavement surrounding the terminal complex. There are currently 5 concourses. They're A, B, C, D, and E, which you can see on the diagram on the screen. And each provides a combination of single taxi lanes, which is the red line on the diagram, and dual taxi lanes, which is the green line on the diagram. The dual taxi lanes provide the ability for aircraft to operate in opposite directions, similar to a roadway. And single taxi lanes only have one bi-directional flow. So only one aircraft can be moving in one direction at a time. Because of this, it results in major ramp congestion, especially in the areas of concourses D and E. Between the two concourses, there are approximately 55 gates, which is about half the capacity, the gate capacity at the airport, which leads to high traffic volumes in that area. And then additionally, Concourse C is the regional jet concourse, which results in more turns or more aircraft movements per gate per day, which also increases the congestion in that area. The second need for the project is in addressing insufficient runway capacity to meet future demand at acceptable levels of delay. An acceptable level of delay for this project was defined as an all-weather average of 7 minutes per operation, and that's runway delay. 7 minutes of runway delay per operation. Airfield simulations were prepared so that we could understand the runway delays currently at Charlotte. The simulations show that the throughput, which is the number of aircraft operations that can be processed by the runways, increases by 13% between 2016 and 2018, whereas all-weather average delays increased by 21%. These changes between throughput and delay demonstrate that the runway system has the ability to achieve greater throughput beyond the 2016 level, but it does so at rapidly increasing delays. So as a result, it's reasonable to conclude that the runway system at Charlotte was approaching capacity in 2016. Between 2028 and 2033, the throughput increase is anticipated to slow to 4%. But as you can see, delays would continue to increase at a rapid pace of 24%. So this relationship, throughput and delay, indicates that the runway system at Charlotte would reach capacity around 2028. So the airport developed a set of project elements to address the needs that were previously described. These elements collectively are referred to as the proposed action. The proposed action in this EA includes a 10,000-foot runway, which you see in the diagram in purple. It includes north and south end-around taxiways. In addition, West Boulevard also requires relocation due to the end-around taxiway and safety areas. The proposed relocation includes using existing roadways, Byram and Piney Top. The other main element includes expanding concourses B and C. It also includes creating dual taxi lanes around the terminal area, closing runway 523 and expanding the ramp areas south to create east-west corridors that allow for more efficient movement of aircraft. The Council on Environmental Quality requires that an EA explore and consider all reasonable and feasible alternatives to the proposed action that meet the purpose and need, but potentially with a lesser environmental impact. So as a result, this EA included a thorough and objective assessment of all alternatives. The virtual presentation that was on our website back in December of 2020 presented the alternatives analysis. And the analysis, what it concluded was that we were carrying forward what we call 3 build alternatives for an analysis of potential environmental impacts. The no action is also required to be carried forward in the EA by the Council on Environmental Quality, even though it doesn't meet the purpose and need. The no action is used as a comparison for all of the build alternatives to compare back to, so that we can understand the level of impacts from each alternative. In the no action alternatives for this EA, all of the airport infrastructure would remain the same as today, except with a few additional independent improvement projects that are currently under design or construction. These projects are circled in orange on the slide, and they have each undergone their own independent NEPA documentation and approval process. These include the Concourse A Phase 2 Pier Ramp Pier, which is located just north of the second pier on A, and there's also additional ramp expansion to the north of that. There's also the north end around taxiway on the center runway, which is on the north end. It also includes west hold pads. And then on the south midfield area, there's a de-ice pad and crossfield taxiway. In the no action scenario, it's very important to understand that even without the new runway and the terminal expansion, operations are forecasted to increase at the airport. And as a result, the airport would continue to experience delays and an increase in congestion on the airfield with the existing runway and shortage of gates. So alternative 1 is the first build alternative that we are carrying forward, and this one you have previously just seen, which is the proposed action. It includes a new runway in the midfield and the north and south end around taxiways. The new runway would be located 3,100 feet to the east of the west runway and 1,200 feet to the west of the center runway. This alternative also includes expansions of concourses B and C, crossfield taxiway corridors, and closing runway 523. And then it also includes the dual taxi lanes around the concourses. The new runway is assumed to primarily be used by departures, and as a result, it's 10,000 feet long. Arrivals are assumed to occur on the west runway, the existing center runway, and the east runway. It is assumed that departures would occur on the new runway and also the east runway. Alternative 2 is very similar to Alternative 1. The new runway is located 3,200 feet to the west or to the east of the west runway and 1,100 feet west of the center runway. This 100-foot shift that you're seeing between Alternative 1 and Alternative 2 is meant to potentially take advantage of future runway separation rule changes by the FAA that allows the runways to be used differently. In this alternative, the runway use is assumed to be exactly the same as Alternative 1, which is the new runway is 10,000 feet long and is a departure runway. So arrivals would occur on the west, center, and east runway, and departures are assumed to occur on the new runway and the east runway. And then our last alternative, Alternative 3, includes a new runway in the midfield. This runway is located 3,400 feet to the east of the west runway and 900 feet to the west of the center runway. This new runway in this alternative is only 8,900 feet long, as it's assumed to be primarily used for arrivals, and therefore a 10,000-foot runway would not be required. So in this alternative, it's assumed arrivals would occur primarily on the west runway, the new runway, and then the east runway. And departures would occur on the existing center runway and the east runway. So each of the build alternatives and the no action alternative were evaluated for their potential impact on 18 resource categories, which are identified on this slide. The next section of the presentation will review the environmental impacts at a high level for each of the categories you see in bold. These include DOT Section 4F, historic, archaeological, and cultural resources, noise and noise compatible land use, and water resources, which includes wetlands, floodplains, surface water, and groundwater. All of the remaining categories that are shown on this slide can be found in the draft EA document with all the information on the potential impacts, along with the ones in bold too. We're just trying to present high-level information here. Okay, so the first category we're going to discuss is historic, architectural, archaeological, and cultural resources. The National Historic Preservation Act is the primary law governing the preservation of historic and prehistoric resources. Section 106 of that act requires the FAA to determine the potential effects of undertakings, or what we call a proposed action or an alternative. The study area defined for historic resources is called the Area of Potential Effect, or APE, and is shown on the screen in purple. This boundary was identified to include all areas that could physically be impacted by the project, but it also includes areas where visual or noise increases could occur. 2 historic resources were identified within the APE boundary. These include the WPA Douglas Airport hangar, which is identified as the #1 on the map, and the old terminal building, which is identified as #2 on the map. Both of these properties are determined to be eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. The impact analysis that we prepared as part of the EA determined that the WPA Douglas Airport hangar would not experience either a direct or indirect adverse effect from the project on any of the alternatives. However, the old terminal building would be removed as under all of the alternatives, and therefore would have a direct adverse effect. The FAA, North Carolina Historic Preservation Office, and the City of Charlotte will enter into a memorandum of agreement to address the impact and to mitigate the adverse effect. All right, moving on to the U.S. Department of Transportation Section 4F. These are resources which are publicly protected, and they include publicly owned parks, recreation areas, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and historic sites of national, local, or state significance. For Section 4F resources in this EA, the study area was the same as historic resources, as historic resources are also Section 4F resources. So the previously two discussed, the WPA Douglas Airport hangar and the old terminal building, are both considered 4F and are located within our study area. And now when you look at 4F impacts, there's two types that you have to look at within NEPA. The first is a physical use, and the second is what we call a constructive use. A physical use would occur when the action involves an actual physical taking of the property. And then a constructive use is when the impacts on the property are so severe that the activities or features that qualify the property for protection are impaired. So implementation of all of the alternatives was determined to have a physical use on the old terminal building. As I just mentioned, it would be physically removed as part of the project. The WPA Douglas Airport hangar was not going to experience a physical or constructive use. And as previously mentioned, to mitigate the impact of the old terminal, an MOA will be prepared between the FAA, North Carolina SHPO, and the City of Charlotte. Okay, the next category is noise and noise compatible land use. I think it's important so that everyone understands that FAA defines a significant impact would occur if the action or the alternative, what we're talking about here is an alternative, would increase noise by a 1.5 decibel or more for a noise sensitive land use within the 65 DNL. So for example, if noise increased from 65.5 to 67, and it was over a noise sensitive area, it would be a significant impact. Just because a noise sensitive facility is located within the 65 DNL noise contour is not a reason for it to be a significant impact. It doesn't mean it's not experiencing noise, but it's just not a significant impact. And one last point I want to make before we talk about each alternative is that the FAA requires that the determination of impacts be used, that we use a noise model. Actual measurements are not allowed to be used. We have to use an actual model, and we have to develop these impacts through the use of contours. So as you see, can you go back a slide, please, Kevin? Alternate one, thank you. Okay, so the exhibit on this, one more forward, sorry. There you go, thank you. Okay, the exhibit on the screen shows the 2033 no action alternative, 65 DNL, and it is in the black hatched area. The 2033 alternative 1, 65 DNL is shown in the blue line. So you can see we overlaid them on each other so you can see the difference between the two contours. The 1.5 dB increase area, or the area that's the significant noise impact area, is shown in the green hatched area. And that area is entirely located over compatible land use. And it's over the airport property, and a little bit is over the Norfolk Southern property. So as a result, there are no significant noise impacts for this alternative. There would be 21 less residential units located within the alternative 1 65 DNL noise contour. There would also be one less school. There would be one more church and one more daycare facility located in the 65 for the alternative 1 noise contour. Okay, next is alternative 2. So again, the no action is shown in the black hatched line, and then the alternative 2 contour is shown in the blue line on this slide. And again, the green hatch shows the 1.5 dB significance area. And as you can see, this is very similar to alternative 1, and that area remains entirely over airport property, and therefore there would be no significant impacts, noise impacts with this alternative. In this alternative, there would be 17 less residential units. There would be 1 less school, 1 more church, and 1 more daycare facility within the alternative 2 noise contour. All right, alternative 3, if you remember back when I described the alternatives and their runway use. So this alternative, the new runway, is used primarily by arrivals, that's what it's assumed. And this slide shows the difference between the no action and the alternative 3 contour, which again, black hatched is no action, the blue line is alternative 3. And as you can see, the 1.5 dB increase area of significant noise increase extends south over residential areas. And so there would be a significant impact with this alternative. And in addition, there would be an increase of 4 residential units, 1 less school, 1 more church, and 1 more daycare facility. So this next slide just is a zoom in of that southern area of where the 1.5 dB extends south. There would be 20 units or 20 housing units located within that significant impact area, approximately 50 people. 20 of, out of the 20 residential units, 16 have been previously sound insulated, and 4 have been offered, however, have declined. All right, so the last category we're going to discuss is water resources. And as I mentioned, this includes wetlands, floodplains, surface waters, and groundwater resources. It also includes wild and scenic rivers, however, there are none in the area. So the study area for this resource was defined by the area that would have physical impacts from the project. And it's identified, you can see in the orange outline on this slide. The construction of all 3 alternatives would result in permanent impact to approximately 5 acres of wetlands, 8,150 linear feet of streams, and those impacts would require an individual permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, and mitigation is required. It's assumed the mitigation would be achieved through the purchase of stream and wetland credits from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services Umbrella Stream and Wetland Mitigation Bank. There would be 13 acres of 100-year floodplains that would be impacted on the south end of the airport property, and this would require coordination with FEMA and remapping of the floodplains. There also would be an addition of 211 acres of new impervious surface, which is new pavement, and this would be accommodated by the airport's existing stormwater system and would not result in impacts. And then lastly, there's 2 wells that are located south of Concourse B that would require to be abandoned, and that would be done so in accordance with federal, state, and local regulations. So to summarize each of the alternatives, alternative 1 and 2 would not have significant impacts. Alternative 3 would result in significant noise impacts. And just as a reminder, alternative 1 is the airport's proposed project at this time. Okay, so moving on to COVID, we just don't want to ignore the fact that COVID exists and has happened. And we know that the magnitude of COVID is still, you know, the effects on the aviation industry are still happening at this time. Despite that, every other major worldwide incident has recovered. The aviation industry has recovered, and there is an underlying demand for air transportation. As across the country, it's unknown how long it'll take to get back to pre-pandemic levels. But Charlotte is seeing very rapid increase and is, as far as I know, back at 2019 levels as we speak today. So they have been one of the faster recovering airports in the country to get back to pre-pandemic levels. So Charlotte will continue to monitor the actual traffic and delays and just make sure that they're tracking the timeframes that we have outlined in this EA and that these are still appropriate for this project. All right, so that ends the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them now and we will do our best to get through them before we move into the public hearing at 2 p.m. If you would like to submit a formal written comment, which we highly encourage, please do so using the email address that you see on the screen, cltcapacityea@landrum-brown.com. Or you can mail them in and address them to Sarah Potter, 4445 Lake Forest Drive, Suite 700, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45242. As I mentioned earlier, all comments must be submitted by June 1st, 2021, and we will respond to the comments in the final EA. And then following that, FAA will publish the final EA and FAA will issue their federal decision. All right, so I'm going to take a second here and just look at the comments that we've received, and then I will read them out, and then Jack and I will respond to them as appropriate. So just give me a second here. Okay, so there's a specific question on the number of flights that are forecasted per day by 2023. Max flights per hour in 2023. I believe the question, we analyzed the years 2028 and 2033. So maybe that question is referring to operations in 2033. So I would encourage the person who asked the question to reference the Appendix B. There's a forecast in there that gives a lot more information than I will provide in this presentation. However, annual operations were assumed to be approximately 675,000. That's what was forecasted in 2033. And on an average day, that equals about 1,851 ops. So I do encourage this person to reference Appendix B for more information on the forecast. The next question is what is the percentage increase from 2016 versus 2033 forecasted? So in 2016, the number of operations forecasted was 545,000-ish. And so the increase to 2033 is approximately a 24% increase over 17 years. So again, that's in Appendix B. These are FAA approved forecasts that were used in this document. So everything has been fairly well vetted through many lines of FAA and the airlines and the airport. Okay, the next question. You mentioned no parks were affected. However, it looks like the airport overlook of the area of 18th Center will be displaced. Is there plans to relocate that? Jack, I'll let you go ahead and answer that.
Sure, thank you for the question. Yes, the overlook is going to be impacted by the project. However, we're already in design for the end-around taxiway around the center runway. That project will start construction this year. And as part of that project, we've already identified the location for a new airport overlook, and it is currently in design. So that overlook location will be in place before the project, or as the project is completing in 2024. So we intend to keep the overlook available until we're ready to move into the new location. But we absolutely wanted to protect that amenity, and we're looking forward to replacing that and enhancing it as part of the part of that project.
All right, the next question is, has FAA considered an alternative measure instead of 65 DNL to ascertain a significant impact? I can't answer that question, and neither really can Jack. That's a question for the FAA. I do know that if you would like to submit that question to them, I'm sure they would be happy to receive it. But this project has to use the current FAA guidance, which is a 1.5 dB increase is considered a significant impact. Okay, so another question, will this presentation and the slide with these responses be available on a website? So this presentation has been recorded and will be posted to the project website. And then also any comments that are written or submitted via the hearing that follows this presentation will be included in the final EA and will include responses to them. And that is the last question I see, unless anybody has any additional ones that they'd like to add. Otherwise, we can take an intermission, and then the public hearing will start promptly at 2 p.m., which is, we'll have more information on this, but this public hearing is just an opportunity for the public to submit oral comments. It's not another question and answer session. It is truly just for the public to submit oral comments, and they will also be included in the final EA and responded to. All right, so with that, I think, you know, we'll hang here for a couple minutes, and if there's any other questions, otherwise we're gonna take a break, and then we'll be back at 2.